On a cold autumn morning in the year 613, a woman of almost 70 years old is dragged to a public square in the city of Renev, in the heart of the Frankish kingdom. Her face, once admired for its extraordinary beauty, is now marked by decades of war, intrigue, and relentless survival. Her silver hair that was once golden as the sun is now disheveled and dirty from months of torture and confinement. This woman who ruled 3 kingdoms as a queen and regent, who set entire armies on the march with a simple order, now she can barely stand as the bloodthirsty crowd shouts insults around her. Her name is ancient Brunhilde, Queen of Australia, and this morning she will face one of the most brutal deaths ever recorded in the history of European monarchs. Her already fragile body will be tied by her hair, arms and legs to 4 wild horses that will depart in opposite directions, tearing her to pieces. Her mortal remains will then be burned, and the ashes scattered to the wind, an attempt to completely erase her existence. But what led this powerful queen to such a horrible end as a Visigoth princess from distant Spain became the most feared, hated, and paradoxically most influential of the medieval Frankish world to understand the bloody fate. Of Brunhilde we must go back more than 50 years to her birth in the Visigodo kingdom of Hispania, present-day Spain, around the year 543, daughter of King Athanagild and Queen Goswinta. Brunhild was born in a world on the brink of collapse. The Western Roman Empire had officially fallen just a few decades before, and Europe was fragmented into rival barbarian kingdoms, fighting for power on a continent where the old order, but a new one, had not yet fully emerged. Visigoths, a Germanic people who had sacked Rome in 410, now ruled most of the Iberian Peninsula, were Arians, followers of a branch of Christianity considered heretical by Roman Catholics, which placed them in constant religious tension with their Frankish neighbors, who had adopted Catholicism under King Clodobius at the beginning of the 6th century. The young Brunhilde received an exceptional education for a woman of her time. She mastered Latin, Gothic, and later the lingua franca, and was also instructed in the arts of rhetoric, mathematics, and classical literature. Her contemporaries described her as extraordinarily beautiful, with golden hair and piercing eyes, but it was his keen intelligence and his fierce ambition, those that would distinguish her throughout her life. In the year 567, at the age of 24, Brunhilde became the centerpiece of a political alliance when her father married her to Sigebert, the first king of Australia, the eastern portion of the Frankish kingdom. This marriage was part of a diplomatic effort to strengthen ties between the Visigoths and the Franks, with her sister Gallswinter, betrothed to Sigebert's brother Chilperic, king of Neustria. Before these marriages, the Merovingian brothers Sigebert Chilperic and Gontran were already involved in a bitter rivalry. The sons of the powerful king Clotaire Io had divided the Frankish kingdom after his death, establishing a pattern of dynastic conflict that would dominate Frankish politics for generations. Sigebert ruled Australia, Chilperic Neustria, and Gontran, Burgundy. When Brunhild arrived at Sigebert's court in Metz, she immediately broke with tradition by converting to Catholicism, abandoning her family's Arianism. This astute move guaranteed her the support of the powerful Frankish clergy and helped legitimize her in the eyes of the people impressed by her beauty, intelligence, and strategic conversion. Siberto quickly fell in love with his new queen. Unlike many Frankish kings who kept several concubines, Sigebert remained monogamous throughout his life, a testament to the power Brunhilde exercised over him. Meanwhile, in the neighboring kingdom of Neustria, a storm was forming in the figure of Fredegunda, a servant of humble origins who had become the lover of King Chilperic when Gallswinter, Brunhild's sister, arrived for her marriage to Chilperic. Fredegunda was temporarily separated, however. Just a few months after the wedding, Gallswinter was found strangled in her bed, and Chilperic quickly elevated Fredegunda to the status of queen. Gallswinter ignited in Brunhilde a thirst for revenge that would define the rest of her life. She convinced her husband Sigebert to declare war against Chilperic, starting a conflict that would last decades and transcend generations. This event also marked the beginning of the legendary rivalry between Brunhilde and Fredegunda, 2 exceptionally powerful and implacable queens, each willing to use all possible means to protect their interests and those of their children. Initially, Sigebert took the advantage in the war against his brother in the year 575. His forces cornered Chilperic at Tournai, and Sigebert was about to be proclaimed king of all the Frankish territories. But after his triumph, two assassins sent by Fredegunde accosted him and stabbed him with poisoned knives, Sigeberto. He died instantly, leaving Brunhilde at the age of 32, a widow in hostile territory, surrounded by enemies, with a son of just 5 years old, the young Childebert II. Here for the first time we see the remarkable resilience and political cunning that would define Brunhilde. Instead of fleeing or accepting defeat, she quickly organized the escape of her son Amitz, where he was proclaimed king, and began to build a support network among the Austrian nobles. She herself was captured and exiled to Rouen, but even in captivity, her acute intellect did not abandon her during her brief exile. Brunhilde attracted the attention of Merobeus, son of Chilperic from a previous marriage, who fell in love with her. Despite due to the age difference, Brunhilde was 32 years old and Merobeus was barely 20. And the fact that she was his aunt-in-law, they married secretly. This union represented a direct threat to Chilperic and Fredegunde, as it gave Brunhilde a potential ally within the enemy family. When Chilperic discovered the marriage, his fury was immense. He marched to Rouen, forcing Brunhilde and Merobeus to seek asylum in a church. Eventually, Mero was captured and forcibly tonsured as a monk, while that Brunhilde managed to escape back to Australia. Merveo, considered a traitor by his own father, would end up committing suicide, or like many, they suspect he would be murdered by order of Fredegunde back in Australia. Brunhilde faced a new challenge as a woman and a foreigner. She had no legal right to officially rule her son. Childebert was the king, but at just 5 years old he needed a regent. The powerful Austrian nobles led by Duke Gogon initially assumed that role, marginalizing Brunhilde, but she was gradually patient and cunning, using a combination of strategic alliances, bribery, and when elimination of opponents was necessary, Brunhild managed to take control as regent of her son, demonstrated exceptional talent for governance by reforming the tax system, building roads and fortresses, sponsoring monasteries and schools, and maintaining diplomatic relations with neighboring kingdoms, including the Byzantine Empire. His letters to the Byzantine Emperor Maurice and Pope Gregory reveal a sophisticated political mind and a deep understanding of the complexities of European geopolitics. Gregory, in particular, praised his upright faith and zeal for good work. Although, as we will see, this favorable opinion would not last as Childebert grew older, Brunhilde carefully educated him in the arts of war and politics when he reached the coming of age. Instead of renouncing power, Brunhilde remained as his main advisor. Effectively co-ruling Australia together, mother and son established an alliance with Childebert's uncle, King Gontran of Burgundy, who, with no surviving children, named Childebert as his heir in 584. Chilperic of Neustria was murdered, possibly by order of his own wife Fredegunde, who feared she was losing her dominion over him with Chilperic dead. Fredegunde assumed control of Neustria as regent from her newborn son Clotaire. Second, the rivalry between the two regent queens began to develop. He intensified both by launching armies against each other in bloody battles that transformed the Frankish kingdom into a permanent battlefield. When King Gontran died in the year 593, Childebert, now 23 years old, inherited Burgundy, uniting it with Australia and becoming the most powerful ruler among the Franks. It seemed that Brunhilde had finally triumphed over her arch-enemy, but Fortune, that capricious goddess so feared by the ancient Romans, was about to show her cruelest side in the year 596. In suspicious circumstances, both Childebert and his young wife died suddenly, most likely poisoned. Rumors pointed to Fredegunde, although some also suspected Austrian nobles dissatisfied with the growing centralizing power of Childebert and Brunhilde. Regardless of who was responsible, Brunhilde, now aged 53, found herself once again in a precarious position with two underage grandchildren to protect the children of mind, Childebert, Theudebert. One aged 10 and Theuderic I aged 9 were proclaimed kings of Australia and Burgundy respectively. Renilde assumed the regency of both kingdoms, effectively controlling 2/3 of Frankish territory. At this point, Her reputation as a capable ruler had already been solidified, but so had her image as a ruthless and dangerously powerful woman, a new Jezebel as some of her detractors called her, referring to the infamous biblical queen. Frederick died in 597, potentially allowing the long feud between the queens to end. But by then, the political tensions Brunhild faced came mainly from within the Frankish aristocracy, traditionally accustomed to a high degree of autonomy, resented her attempts to centralize power, and many questioned the legitimacy of a woman, especially a foreign and now elderly woman wielding so much power as her grandchildren grew older. Brunhild faced a problem that many regents faced, transferring power. To their tour-de-tours protégés from Australia, particularly began to resent his grandmother's interference. When reached adulthood around 600, he rebelled against her, forcing her to flee to Burgundy, where her other grandson Theuderic still accepted her guidance. The brothers, manipulated by their respective advisors, soon turned against each other. Brunhilde, seeing an opportunity to regain her influence in Australia, actively encouraged hostility between her grandsons. In 610, she convinced Theuderic to declare war against Theudebert, possibly falsely claiming that Theudebert was actually the son of a gardener, not from Childebert, and therefore illegitimate. The war between the brothers culminated in the year 612 with the defeat of Theudebert, who he was captured along with his young son under pressure from Brunhild. Theuderic ordered his brother to be forcibly tonsured and sent to a monastery, a fate considered more merciful than death. However, shortly after Theudebert was executed and, his son, barely a child, had his skull crushed against a stone by order of Brunhild. The brutality of this act, even in an era known for its violence, shocked contemporaries and permanently stained Brunhild's reputation. Brunhild, having now eliminated, a grandson ruled through the other, controlling both Australia and Burgundy, but fortune had a crueler turn in store just weeks. After his triumph, Theuderic died suddenly of dysentery, leaving 4 small children, all still children at the age of 69. Brunhilde found herself once again as regent now of her great-grandchildren, and with more enemies than ever, her decision was to appoint Theuderic's eldest son, Sigiberto Icaro, a boy of barely 10 years old, as King of Australia, and Burgundy ignoring the other 3 brothers. This decision that violated the Frankish tradition of dividing the kingdom between all the sons further alienated the nobility. Meanwhile, on the other side of the border, Fredegunde's son, Clotaire, I had grown up and ruled. Neustria, raised by his mother to hate Brunhilde, and now a man of approximately 28 years old, he saw in this moment of weakness an opportunity to eliminate his former enemy and reunify the Frankish kingdom under his Clothian control. He formed an alliance with important Austrian and Burgundian nobles, including the powerful palace steward Guanachario, who had been publicly humiliated by Brunhild. Together they marched against the armies still loyal to the old queen. Clothar, his great-grandsons were captured, 2 were immediately killed and the 3rd was exiled. As for Brunhilde, she tried to flee but was captured near Lake Neuchâtel in modern-day Switzerland. The son of her arch-enemy now had her in his power, and his revenge would be terrible for 3 days. Brunhild was tortured and publicly humiliated, mounted upside down on a camel and paraded throughout the Clothian military camp. He personally accused her of having caused the death of 10 Frankish kings, an exaggerated accusation, but one that reflected the fear and respect she inspired in the mock trial that followed. Guilty not only of multiple regicides, but also of witchcraft and debauchery, standard accusations against powerful women throughout history. On the morning of October 13, 613, Brunhilde faced her execution with the same indomitable strength she had shown throughout her life. She was condemned to the most terrible death her captors could imagine. She was taken to a public square in Renev, there before a crowd of soldiers and nobles. The queen, who had once ruled most of Gaul, was tied by her hair, arms and legs to 4 wild horses. They struggled against the knots, and the old queen's body was suspended in the air, stretched to the limit. Then, with a horrible sound of flesh, tearing themselves apart, the horses set off, each taking a piece of the body of the once mighty Brunnhild. Her still throbbing mortal remains were thrown into a bonfire and reduced to ashes, that were then scattered to the wind in an attempt to deny her even a grave where her followers could venerate her memory. Thus ended the extraordinary life of Brunhilde of Austrasia, a life that spanned 7 decades and saw her rise from foreign princess to de facto ruler of 2/3 of the Frankish kingdom. Her son 2 grandchildren, and saw his great-grandsons briefly on the throne before his final fall, Clotaire II, after his victory, reunified the Frankish kingdom and ruled for 16 years, implementing reforms that, ironically, were based on many of the policies that Brunhild had initiated. The Edict of Paris that she promulgated in 614 established greater autonomy for the nobles, precisely what Brunhild had fought against, but also codified many of the administrative and legal reforms that she had introduced in the years following her death. Brunhild's reputation suffered a systematic campaign of defamation by chroniclers linked to the Clothaire's court, portrayed her as a malevolent witch thirsting for power, and sexually depraved Bishop Gregoride Tours, who had previously praised her piety and governmental skill, saw her chronicles edited and reinterpreted to emphasize the negative aspects of her character. History, as always, was written by the victors. However, even through this negative propaganda, Brunhild's greatness cannot be completely obscured. The documents that survive from her long reign reveal a remarkably effective ruler who kept civilization functioning in an era of chaos. The Roman roads she restored in Gaul were known as Brunhild's roads during more than 1,000 years after his death, a testimony-lasting impact on the kingdom's infrastructure. What makes Brunhilde's story so fascinating is not only her horrific ending, but the fact that she defied all expectations and limitations placed on women of her time in a world dominated by male warriors. She ruled through intelligence, cunning manipulation, and sheer force of will. Her ability to survive and thrive for decades facing betrayals, defeats, exiles, and devastating personal losses reveals an almost superhuman resilience. Her rivalry with Fredegonda, another woman who refused to accept the limitations of their gender and social origin, produced one of the most extraordinary figures of medieval history. These 2 queens, through the sheer force of their personalities, steered the course of Frankish history for over 4 decades, demonstrating that even in a deeply patriarchal society, power could be wielded by those determined enough to take it. The brutal death of Brunhild, tied to 4 horses and literally torn to pieces, reflects the deep fear she inspired. No other Frankish monarch ever received such spectacularly cruel punishment, an indication of the threat she posed not only to Clotaire's rule, but to the entire patriarchal order. To eliminate Brunnhilde was enough to simply kill her. She needed to be completely obliterated, her body destroyed, her ashes scattered, and her memory permanently stained. Despite all efforts to erase her legacy, Brunhilde of Austrasia remains one of the most powerful and fascinating figures in medieval European history. Her life, marked by relentless ambition, political cunning, and yes, cruelty when necessary, offers a unique insight into the inner workings of power in early medieval Europe, and her terrible end reminds us of the consequences that often awaited those who dared to defy the conventions of your time, especially if they were women. In Renev Square, as the 4 horses set off in opposite directions, taking with them the limbs of the old queen, a surprising chapter was closed in the history of the Brunhilde Franks of Austrasia. The queen, who for so long had defied her enemies, finally found an adversary who could not defeat. The very time that eventually is today betrays even the most powerful and resilient among we.